John Fitzgerald Kennedy was the most charismatic US president of the 20th century. His youth and his intellectual brilliance promised a new era in American politics. But he was also a reckless sexual adventurer.
He said, Bobby, I get a migraine headache if I don't get a strange piece of ass every day.
At least 5 of Kennedy's conquests were a danger to national security. But the president ignored the warnings.
He's sleeping with a woman that's kind of come to him out of organized crime, mafia.
Now recently released documents and eyewitness accounts prove that the press were ready to expose these dangerous liaisons.
It would have spelled the end of any hope that President Kennedy could be re-elected, and possibly even his impeachment.
On November the 22nd, 1963, JFK was assassinated in Dallas. The world mourned the death of a great man cut down before he could achieve his promise. But did the assassin's bullet save his reputation? New York City, May the 19th, 1962. 15,000 people watched Marilyn Monroe entertain John F. Kennedy in honor of his 45th birthday. He was the most powerful man in the world, but Monroe could have destroyed him.
To go out with the biggest sexual movie icon of the era was insanity.
A handful of insiders knew that the increasingly unstable Marilyn might reveal her secret affair with the married president.
She was a very fragile person on many medications, mentally ill, some would say.
But Marilyn was just one in a series of reckless sexual affairs that Kennedy pursued during his flamboyant presidency.
I mean, this was, in the real sense, a man who was addicted to sex. And he did think he could get away with it. His very close friend, Senator George Smathers, told me once, he said, you know, where sex was concerned, John F. Kennedy thought he could walk on water. He thought he was untouchable, invulnerable.
JFK's addiction to sex began long before he arrived in the White House. He grew up in an elite world, part of a powerful Boston family. Their sexual habits would have shocked conservative middle America.
Kennedys came from an aristocratic background where you had mistresses and it was accepted, and everybody went in knowing that, including the wives. They knew it was just part of their world and it was accepted.
He was an aristocrat who sampled all of the candy in the box. If it had a skirt, he sampled it.
His imperious father, Joe, was a banker and one of the richest men in America. But he often cheated on his wife, Rose. One summer, Mrs. Kennedy invited future Vice President Lyndon Johnson to visit their Florida holiday home. Bobby Baker, then senior aide to Johnson, was present that day.
While we were outside having lunch, old man Joe Kennedy walks in with an 18-year-old golf caddy that he had picked up in South France, walked right by all of us, never said boo or damn you or whatnot. And I still remember the groaning and the grunting in the bedroom on the second floor with old man Joe Kennedy. So President Kennedy, he had the genes from his father.
Joe Kennedy was a patriarch who wanted his sons to be like him. But JFK didn't share his father's robust good health. He suffered from the genetic condition Addison's disease. The illness affects the kidneys and leads to chronic fatigue. The treatment with testosterone and cortisone had an interesting side effect.
People treated with this new drug, as it was then, for Addison's disease, men and women both alike, became exceptionally sexually eager and active, and their libidos were enormously enhanced.
But even with the treatment, he was often seriously ill. On 4 occasions, he was given the last rites.
He began to think of himself as on the edge of death, always. And he lived like he was on the edge of death, always, which is one way to say recklessly. And his attitude with women was reckless in the extreme.
This recklessness led him into sleeping with a potential enemy during the Second World War. In 1941, JFK joined the Navy, and he was to serve with bravery and distinction. He was soon working in naval intelligence in Washington. There he began an affair with a married Danish journalist, Inga Arvid. To JFK, she was Inga Binga. To the FBI, she was a suspected Nazi spy.
Inga Arvid knew Hermann Goering very well. She attended his wedding. She knew Adolf Hitler. So consequently, when she came to the United States as a journalist, she was a suspect and was investigated by the FBI.
Kennedy gossiped to Arvid about his assignments. Then the affair was discovered. His superiors wanted to kick him out of the Navy. Instead, he was transferred to South Carolina, and Arvid followed.
The FBI had wiretaps and microphones on Inga Arvid. A torrid romance resulted. They were at the hotel for 3 days one time and barely came out of their rooms.
Even his father, Joe, thought sex with a potential spy was a step too far.
Joe Kennedy sadly shook his head and said, I should have gelded him at a very young age.
Kennedy entered politics at the age of 29, immediately after the war. He knew that FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover had kept the tape recordings of his fling with Inga Arvid. It was the beginning of a lifelong tension between Hoover and Kennedy. In 1953, a year after he became a senator, JFK married the beautiful Jacqueline Bouvier. It was the society wedding of the year.
With a pretty wife and a politically rising star, the future seems bright for the junior senator.
Jackie came from a similar aristocratic background. Her father was a notorious womanizer, so she'd learnt that affairs had to be tolerated. But Middle America was less forgiving of adultery. In 1958, Senator Kennedy risked political ruin when he was photographed leaving a mistress's apartment. Florence Cater, a devout Catholic, had discovered he was having an affair with one of her tenants. She went on a mission to expose him. She wrote to 35 newspapermen, but no one would pursue the story.
In those days, the press corps was all men, or 99% men, and they sort of envied Kennedy, and they didn't want to report it because, as it was told to me, they didn't want to ruin his game.
We had this notion of a public life and a private life. And the public life was one thing, and the private life was nobody's business.
Kennedy believed that he was untouchable. But soon the rising political star would be playing a much more dangerous game, sleeping with a woman who had been provided for him by the mafia.
John F. Kennedy had left himself open to horrendous compromise.
By 1960, John Kennedy, already a successful senator, was campaigning hard for the presidency. His millionaire father, Joe, used all his connections to help him. He even enlisted his old contacts in the mafia.
He made his fortune, at least initially, as a bootlegger. And he therefore had connections, so that he knew the mob in the way in which was perhaps unique in the United States. He knew who to see and who to talk to if he wanted to raise money, and he did. So the money for the mob came through the father into the campaign.
Joe traveled to Chicago to strike a deal with the main mafia bosses, who wielded powerful influence through the American labor unions.
I've met the witnesses who were there when this happened, and the idea was, if you help my son get elected, we'll give you carte blanche in Las Vegas. And they were all for that, so the Chicago mob not only turned out the vote in Chicago, but with all the labor unions across the country that they controlled from coast to coast, it was a major factor in the election.
The Mafia could see the benefits of having a friend in the White House, and now they tried to seal the friendship with a kiss. Their opportunity arose when JFK broke off from campaigning to visit Las Vegas in February 1960. He wanted to hang out with Frank Sinatra and his showbiz buddies, known as the Rat Pack.
They all called him Jack. The entire Rat Pack, Sinatra and Sammy Davis and Dean Martin, they would just party all night and then dry out the next morning in the steam bath of the Sands Hotel. And they all had their monogrammed bathrobes for the sauna, and they had on JFK's, it said Chicky Baby. That was his Rat Pack nickname. I mean, that's how tight he was with this group.
Count Guido Diro was one of the croupiers at the Sands Casino. He witnessed the debauchery in the steam room.
And you sat around a table and you played cards while underneath the table, you know, women circulated to do whatever your bidding was sexually, like Caligula's palace.
When JFK came to town, the party began with the Rat Pack performing on stage. New information uncovered by author Anthony Summers suggests that Kennedy was about to walk into a potential honey trap. The deep throat for the story was Rat Pack stalwart Sammy Davis Jr.
They knew that Kennedy would want a girl while he was in town, so they cast around as to find one, and who would it be? And the person who organized it was the mafia boss, Sam Giancana.
Giancana was head of the Chicago mob that had once been run by Al Capone. Joe Kennedy had asked him to support his son's election campaign.
I saw him, I knew who he was, and I did my damnedest to stay away from him.
As Kennedy's party enjoyed the show, a woman approached their table. She was Judith Campbell, a young divorcee from Los Angeles. The mafia knew her well. She'd been close to Giancana's lieutenant, Johnny Rosselli.
We knew that she was connected, was a Rosselli girlfriend.
Judith knew Johnny Rosselli very well, you know, from Hollywood. They shared an apartment together, I believe, for a time.
Showbiz agent Milt Evans was at Kennedy's table that night. He later told author Anthony Summers why Campbell had appeared.
Peter Lawford, the president's brother-in-law, later told Evans that she'd been given $200 to provide her services to the president that night. And I believe Evans. I think it was a commercial exchange and the first of many.
We thought of her as a very high-priced working girl.
The mafia's skill at exploiting human weaknesses gave them an opportunity to snare the future president of the United States.
And what this whole thing smells of is that even as early as when he was running for the presidency, that the mafia saw a way to get its hooks into this important politician who might be headed for the White House.
They contributed to his election campaign, and they'd paid for his personal pleasures. But JFK seemed oblivious to the risks. In his mind, sex and politics were completely separate.
He's sleeping with a woman that's kind of come to him out of organized crime, mafia circumstances. I think that may be a scandal publicly, but what it is, from the mob's perspective, not Kennedy's, is crossing the line.
John Kennedy was inaugurated as the 35th President of the United States on Friday, the 20th of January, 1961. He promised to wage war on poverty, injustice, and discrimination.
I, John Fitzgerald Kennedy, do solemnly swear that you will
He talked of a new frontier of hope for all Americans. However, he was elected by a narrow margin, and didn't have a reliable majority in Congress. His political vision would remain frustrated. And meanwhile, FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover had ordered a review of the file on Kennedy's sex life. He'd always been an avid collector of the intimate details of politicians' lives. Hoover, the arch-conservative, was angered when Jack appointed his ambitious younger brother Bobby as Attorney General, Hoover's boss.
Hoover was the mean, vindictive, paranoid old man. Everything fueled his anger at the world. That the Kennedys became president, Jack, the president, and Robert, Attorney General, just boiled him unbelievably.
Hoover needed presidential approval to keep his job. But he was a political survivor who'd outlasted 6 presidents. He'd no intention of letting Kennedy oust him.
He collected information on everybody, and that's how he maintained his position for 5 decades. He had rooms full of file cabinets on people. The knowledge that he had it, that's all he needed, for them to know that he had it.
The Kennedy administration had promised a new moral era. At the Justice Department, Bobby Kennedy now unleashed a major campaign against organized crime. While the president's brother was fighting the enemy, the president was sleeping with it. Mobsters like Johnny Rosselli were being investigated by the then prosecutor Robert Blakey. Rosselli knew Judith Campbell well, and now she was having a full-blown affair with the president.
What we would do is do what's called link analysis. We would take John Rosselli and see everybody that he called. And then you would take everybody that he called and see every person that they did. Well, John Rosselli called Judith Campbell, who called Evelyn Lincoln. Evelyn Lincoln's the president's secretary. What is this party girl calling the White House?
Over the coming months, Campbell phoned the White House 70 times. And some of the later calls confirmed the FBI's worst fears.
We had wiretaps and microphones on Sam Giancana at the time because of his connections and leadership of organized crime. Judith Campbell Exner was occasionally called the White House and set up rendezvous with John F. Kennedy in the White House, or the White House would be calling Chicago asking for her. So as a result, when we'd hear the White House on the telephone, it became very embarrassing to the FBI.
It was clear to the FBI that the president was having a sexual liaison with an intimate of some of the most powerful gangsters in America. It was political dynamite. Hoover used it to reinforce his position and to remind the president of his potential vulnerability.
Well, first Mr. Hoover went to see Bobby Kennedy, who was Attorney General at the time, and told him about it. Well, he asked him, Mr. Hoover, go see the president and describe in lurid detail what was going on. And Mr. Hoover did, and the president made no comment.
The White House visit was over lunch, one of only 6 occasions when JFK and Hoover met during the presidency. Kennedy aide Kenny O'Donnell later revealed the mood of the meeting.
The president was rather arrogant about it, apparently, and wound up the lunch as swiftly as he could and said to his aide, who was ushering Hoover in and out, "Get rid of that bastard, he's the biggest bore."
Judith Campbell claimed that Kennedy phoned her afterwards. He warned her that her phone was bugged, then told her how infuriated he was.
Sure.
Far from being abashed or cowed that the director of the FBI had found that he was going with a woman who was also in touch with a top mafia boss, he was just furious, furious that anyone had dared to intervene or tell him how to live his private life.
Hoover had challenged the president, effectively warning him that his private life had now become a matter of public interest. Yet JFK seemed to thrive on the danger, and so far he was getting away with it. Just 2 days after Hoover's warning about Judith Campbell, Kennedy took an even bigger risk.
Far from being cowed into backing off from women, he was in California going at it again with someone else.
And that someone else was Hollywood's most desirable woman, Marilyn Monroe.
One thing about Marilyn Monroe, she was a beautiful woman, in that sense attractive, but she was also psychologically a child.
But in the eyes of J. Edgar Hoover, Monroe was just as dangerous as Judith Campbell. Documents recently released under the Freedom of Information Act revealed that the FBI thought Marilyn was a communist sympathizer.
She was led down the path of various extreme liberalism on occasions.
She was in favor of civil rights. In the 50s, she married the playwright Arthur Miller. He had a background of being close to communists and possibly had been a member of the Communist Party himself. She was certainly of the left.
In 1962, even flirting with communism was seen as dangerous political heresy. President Kennedy himself was an uncompromising opponent of communist ideology. Hostility between the US and Soviet Russia had reached new heights.
The hardest thing to understand for today's generation is what it was really like to exist under the threat of nuclear annihilation daily. Perhaps tomorrow we're going to blow up, so we have to micro-study everything to see if it's going to lead to World War III, and that was the tension of the time.
Anyone who associated with communists fell under suspicion. FBI documents released this year show concerns about a trip Marilyn took to Mexico in February 1962. The letters SMC under her name stand for Security Matter Communist.
While there, she spent time with a number of people who were American communists.
And one of them was Frederick Vanderbilt Field, a long-time Marxist who had fled the US and had close links with other communists in Mexico.
Field told me that of the many things they talked about, one was her relationship and the conversation she'd had with the president's brother, Bobby Kennedy. Here was an actress who gabbed too much, gabbing to fully paid-up, recognized communists about the president's brother and about what she was learning or thought she was learning of US policy.
The FBI were concerned that Marilyn might leak highly secret information picked up from the Kennedys. In July 1962, an FBI informer noted that she had discussed atomic weapon testing with the president. For the FBI, this was a potential security lapse. One of Kennedy's greatest political achievements was his skillful handling of the tension between Soviet Russia and America. This would reach its peak with the Cuban Missile Crisis, when the Russians smuggled nuclear missiles into America's backyard. JFK would demonstrate strong leadership during the incident, but his own loose talk to Marilyn could be endangering America.
Even his views or his thoughts, his opinions as to what US policy should be on the matter of atomic testing would have been of enormous interest to any communist government. And Hoover, on learning this information at the FBI, would rightly have thought that this was a serious matter. It would be yet another card to play in his power battle with the Kennedy brothers.
By the summer of 1962, Marilyn Monroe's life was beginning to unravel. She was suffering from the effects of too many drugs. There is still speculation about the nature of her relationship with the president.
In Kennedy's mind, she was just another girl. But in her mind, in her unhinged view of the world and her love of this icon, John F. Kennedy, she, I think, really saw herself as the next first lady or his next wife or whatever.
She was a lay for Jack Kennedy, nothing more.
A breathless performance at JFK's birthday celebration revealed a woman walking a very public tightrope.
It's rather clear that by that time, even the great risk-taker, John F. Kennedy, was drawing away from Marilyn, that Some have said that that night was his last date with her.
Marilyn's body was found on August the 5th, 1962, at her Los Angeles home. Was she a casualty of JFK's relentless quest for sexual adventure?
People ask, did the Kennedys kill Marilyn Monroe? And my answer is yes, but indirectly.
If she took too many pills because she was despondent over her relationship with the president, yeah, he contributed to her death. And recklessly so.
Marilyn's phone records for July show that she made several calls to Bobby Kennedy's Justice Department. And there was also a link to the president.
Consider this. In the bedclothes, they found a scrap of paper with a number written on it, and that number turned out to be a number of the Kennedy White House.
Whatever really happened on that night, both Kennedy brothers came perilously close to being exposed.
And there's a great deal of evidence that the precise circumstances of Marilyn Monroe's death was covered up. They had to have been afraid that a massive scandal would break around the president. It was a scandal that would certainly have destroyed this man. Once again, Kennedy's sexual brinkmanship was coming close to destroying him.
The final year of the president's life brought the threat of new sex scandals, with even the press hinting more and more at his dangerous liaisons. By 1963, John Fitzgerald Kennedy had proved himself a courageous statesman, avoiding the threat of nuclear war during the Cuban Missile Crisis. It would lead to an atomic test ban treaty with the Russians. His popularity was soaring, and JFK seemed likely to win a second term. But when a massive sex and spying scandal engulfed Britain that summer, it came close to destroying him. In June, British Minister for War John Profumo was forced to resign after he admitted his relationship with showgirl Christine Keeler. She was part of a group of call girls clustered around society osteopath Stephen Ward. But this wasn't just a Tory minister caught with his pants down. Keeler had also been sleeping with Yevgeny Ivanov, a Soviet naval attaché and spy. Profumo's affair with Keeler was seen as a security risk. At first, JFK was simply intrigued.
And he was interested in what had gone on. I think that partly this was just purely kind of voyeurism. He was asking for reports, he was asking for newspaper articles to be sent to him. But fairly quickly this changed. You can see around June the 8th, 1963, a major change. You see meetings of senior figures close to Kennedy. They are taking a major interest in what seems to be a minor sex scandal in London.
Secret Serviceman Larry Newman was on presidential protection duty in Los Angeles on June the 8th. Here he became acutely aware that Kennedy didn't want to be associated in any way with the Profumo affair.
As we flew out of Los Angeles, all we heard was the president was livid about the front page of a local newspaper that showed a picture of us throwing the White House press secretary in the swimming pool. There was an article right underneath the picture about the Profumo scandal, and the headline on the paper said JFK hijinks.
In Washington, too, there was growing concern about the Profumo case.
They were beginning to get reports that Americans may be involved in this British scandal.
One of the call girls in Stephen Ward's circle was saying that President Kennedy was involved. She was Mariella Novotny. Novotny was the S&M tease of Stephen Ward's set. But she also claimed to be closely related to the communist president of Czechoslovakia.
Mariana herself had actually spent some time in Czechoslovakia. So immediately the security people, when a name cropped up in the Profumo scandal and in America, these connections started to raise fears of another security scandal. Possibly she was a plant by the Soviets.
By the summer of 1963, Novotny had made a startling claim. She alleged that whilst working in New York, she'd had sex with JFK on several occasions, around about the time of his inauguration. Her own memoir details one encounter.
The first time I met JFK was at a large party held at the Hampshire House. JFK was simply called the Senator, and we were shown into an empty bedroom. He talked about England briefly, but locked the door and undressed as he chatted. But it was over fast. After his climax, he calmed considerably and dressed coolly. He said we would meet again.
An FBI document states that she was part of a call girl ring allegedly close to JFK. A few weeks after her encounters with Kennedy, Novotny was arrested for prostitution in an FBI sting. She then fled the United States. When she arrived in Britain, she spoke to a journalist about her encounters.
Within a week, she'd spoken to Peter Earle of the News of the World, and she told him about Kennedy, and he believed her. Earle said that at that particular time, it was a great story, but there was no way you could use it. No British newspaper would dare run such a story.
If the British press wouldn't take the risk of publishing, one American newspaper was prepared to run a story.
The New York Journal American started to pick up these gossips and whispers, and they began to make inquiries.
This wasn't just a hunt for a juicy sex story. The Kennedys were planning a re-election campaign, and they had powerful enemies in the media.
The New York Journal American was a Hearst newspaper. It was on the right, it was anti-Kennedy. The people on the newspaper itself, such as the editor Guy Richards, were very extreme right-wingers, hated anything to do with the Kennedys. It had been the source for leaks from Hoover.
Two of the Journal American reporters contacted Novotny. She asked Peter Earle of the News of the World to help. The Americans recorded Earle as he passed on Novotny's story, while she listened in. For Kennedy, this spelled extreme danger. Then on the 29th of June, with Kennedy out of the country, the New York Journal American dared to publish their story. They didn't name the president, but used a cleverly coded reference linking a high US aide with one of the girls in the Profumo case.
To the public, this was meaningless. Washington insiders knew it was a reference to President Kennedy.
And this was the closest anyone had come to exposing his scandalous relationships with women who posed a security threat. The article also contained another potential bombshell, a reference to a girl named Susie Chang. Born in communist China, she'd worked in the same London club as Mariella Novotny. Chang acknowledges that she met JFK in London in the late 1950s. Though the FBI files are still heavily censored, a document states that she was both a call girl and a procurer, caught up in the same New York vice ring as Novotny.
By definition, associating with Susie Chang, a woman who'd been born in communist China, and with Mariella Novotny, both these people spelled danger at the height of the Cold War just by who they were. In Novotny's case, there's something specific. According to her, when she came back from her time in New York after sleeping with John Kennedy, she came home and Stephen Ward, the man at the heart of the Profumo affair, introduced her to Ivanov, the Soviet naval attaché.
Mariella Novotny later admitted that she too slept with the naval attaché Ivanov, and she was also offering another service to the Russian.
She seemed to be offering information. He reported that to the KGB, he said, and later heard that the KGB was working with Novotny.
The American press was uncovering a story that could destroy Kennedy. The ideal family man, the president who promised to fight corruption and promote civil rights, had allegedly been sleeping with a hooker who was also in bed with the Reds.
That weekend, there was absolute panic in Washington. Cables, and we'll see this in the FBI file, flew across the Atlantic to Kennedy in London.
Bobby Kennedy immediately summoned the journalists who'd written the article to a showdown meeting. We know what happened because Hoover's FBI liaison was present and wrote a detailed memo.
He asked them what was the source of their stories, and like any good journalist, they refused to reveal them.
They even played Bobby the tape of their conversation with the News of the World journalist and Novotny.
He asked them who the high US aide mentioned in the story was, and they were upfront with him and said it was a reference to the president. This must have been a moment that Bobby Kennedy must have feared and seen coming and hoped it would never come for years. And there it was. This was nearly breaking as a major story in the press.
Bobby then threatened the newspaper owners with an iron fist. He said he'd use powerful anti-monopoly legislation to attack the Hearst Corporation. That stopped any further details of the story emerging.
Once again, the Kennedys got away with it, but there was a ticking clock, a feeling of a ticking clock at this point, and the clock had some way to go in the months that remained to John Kennedy.
But even though Bobby Kennedy had silenced the press for now, at the end of the meeting, the journalists hinted at one more bombshell.
But intriguingly, they left this little statement dangling in the air as an implied threat that actually they had a bigger story.
Just one day later, on July the 2nd, J. Edgar Hoover informed Bobby Kennedy of a security investigation into yet another presidential affair. Ellen Romech would prove the most dangerous woman of all. She was a 27-year-old wife of a sergeant in the West German military mission in Washington.
Ellen Romech was as beautiful as Elizabeth Taylor.
She'd arrived in America in January 1961 and quickly went from soldier's wife to a mink-clad sports car driving party girl. But then in 1963, an informant told the FBI that she was connected at the highest level to the East German Communist Party.
Ellie Romech had been born in East Germany, and what appears to have worried the FBI especially about that is that there was a report early on that as a very young woman she'd been some sort of an aide in the apparatus of the East German leader, Walter Ulbricht.
Romech became a regular at Bobby Baker's Quorum Club, which was a watering hole for powerful politicians. Baker knew their personal tastes through his job as secretary to the Democratic Party in the Senate.
Most politicians are unusually horny. Cock on the brain. I mean, that's all they talked about was who could do what.
Ellen Romech entertained the clientele, according to Baker.
She was a real true party girl. One of my Texas friends was so thrill with his liaison with Ellen Romich that he gave her $5,000 for one date.
Soon, Romech was catching the eye of someone quite significant.
President Kennedy's best friend and his wingman, Bill Thompson, was there, and he came over to me and he said, "Where in the hell did you get this beautiful girl?" And I said, "She is a German, and she is a real sharp party girl." And Bill Thompson asked me if she could go have dinner with the president. So I arranged for Ellen Romich to go to Bill Thompson's apartment, and he took her to the White House on many occasions.
The president admired Romech, Baker claims, for one special talent.
And he called me after his first meeting with Ellen and said that that was the best oral sex he'd ever had.
The president's intimacy with a woman with apparent communist connections was potentially a major security threat.
It was widely believed that she was a spy, and it was the belief that she was that was enough to create the scandal.
Now, all it needed was for this private scandal to become public.
It would have spelled certainly the end of any hope that President Kennedy could be re-elected, and possibly even his impeachment.
Bobby Kennedy, fighting to protect his brother's reputation, knew that he had to act fast.
And it's clear that Bobby Kennedy must rapidly have understood that this was a real threat to his brother.
When it came to the attention of Robert Kennedy, he literally deported her to get her out of the country.
On August 21st, 1963, Ellen Romech had her visa revoked and was flown back to Germany on Bobby Kennedy's orders.
For the moment, it looked as though he'd once again put the lid on the danger posed by Ellen Romech with her East German connections.
Kennedy had avoided the crisis. But that month, he endured a personal tragedy when Jackie gave birth to a son, Patrick. The baby was gravely ill. When Kennedy went to see his stricken infant, Secret Serviceman Larry Newman was at his side.
Children's ward was dark, and at the end of the hall was his son, who was in intensive and critical care. And on the way down the hall, we passed a room with two little girls in it. And he asked what was wrong with the girls, and the doctor told him they had severe burns all over their body. And one of them might lose the use of her hands, and the other, her bib had caught fire, and they looked like to be 3 or 4 years old. Very delightful, pretty little girls. Kennedy hesitated for a minute, asked for a pen, and wrote to each of them a note. There was no photo op. There was nothing like you see today. Nobody said anything about it. And then he walked down to the end of the hall to see his son. And it was the most humbling thing I'd ever seen with any person I'd ever protected. It was just simply the act of a prince.
Baby Patrick died soon after. The family tragedy touched the American public. With his popularity high, Kennedy was now planning to run for a second term in office. Within 3 months, he would go to Dallas to boost his ratings. But in September 1963, a political scandal exploded. It involved Bobby Baker, senior political secretary in the Senate. It also threatened to expose JFK's affair with Ellen Romech, the woman suspected of being a communist spy.
A scandal was about to break around him, and he was going to lose his job because of allegations of corruption and influence peddling.
A Senate inquiry was beginning to reveal Baker's role in providing escorts for top politicians.
I was in the headlines all over the world, comparing what Perfumo did with what was happening in my case.
The Bobby Baker investigation fueled American press interest in the Romech story. One paper now published a coded reference to her sexual relationships.
The Des Moines Register ran a story saying that Ellen Romech had been deported, but said that she'd been sexually involved with prominent New Frontiersmen. Now, the New Frontier was what Kennedy had said his presidency would aim for. It was completely clear in people's minds that the reference was to the White House.
The article triggered panic. A woman investigated as a serious security risk by the FBI was being linked with the presidency.
It had the most potential to explode and to cause a scandal of the likes we had never seen before.
On the day of publication, the White House made 5 calls to the FBI, asking them to smother the story. The president himself was personally interested in having the story killed. FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover responded by saying that it wasn't his job. Bobby Kennedy went into action yet again. He telephoned Clark Mollenhoff, the journalist who had written the story. When pressed to reveal who he was referring to within the White House, Mollenhoff refused.
One can assume that there were threats similar to the threats that had happened earlier in the summer, and certainly there were no more stories.
Bobby Kennedy had gagged the press once again. But he could not yet control the Senate committee investigating Bobby Baker's party girl activities.
He knew that if Ellen Romech was given immunity and testified truthfully, that his brother would either be impeached or would be forced to resign.
The Kennedys were cornered, and Bobby Kennedy knew it. He had to take desperate measures. He asked Hoover to stop the Senate inquiry.
He said this would be greatly harmful to the presidency, and I would appreciate it if you would go up personally and see these senators and ask them not to hold hearings on the matter.
Director Hoover at first refused to do it. A humiliated Bobby Kennedy had to literally beg him to go and do it, and Hoover did go and met secretly at home, with this we know from the documents, with the 2 senior senators.
Hoover told the senators that his files showed highly embarrassing links between many Washington politicians and Bobby Baker's party girls. A full-scale investigation could bring down the walls on everyone.
Hoover later was able to call the White House, playing his power card again, and say, and I quote from the document, "Everything is well in hand. The senators assured me they will say nothing. They won't talk or say anything." It could not be more obvious that this was a real cover-up and that the Kennedys were now not only compromised by the sexual affair, but beholden to J. Edgar Hoover.
The gossip had been that Hoover was about to lose his post. But on October the 29th, Bobby Kennedy told him that his job was safe after all. "Rumors of my demise," Hoover triumphantly noted, "would appear to be premature." On October the 31st, he lunched with a grateful president. It would be their final meeting. But the danger had not yet passed. The world's press were offering a fortune to hear Ellen Romech's story. It seemed that John Kennedy's reputation depended on the silence of one woman.
People were making major offers of money to her to tell her story on television or in the newspapers. As it turns out, she turned those offers down, apparently because the Kennedys had paid her off, given her enough to shut her mouth. But they couldn't be sure of that. The FBI was still investigating. It was rumbling away.
With the scandal still threatening to explode, JFK headed for Texas as part of his re-election campaign. The FBI was still monitoring the situation. The very next day, the president paraded through the streets of Dallas.
He went to Dallas because his popularity was slipping below 60%. Our president now does pretty good at 40.
The president's car is now turning onto Elm Street, and it will be only a matter of minutes before he arrives at the trademark. I was on Simmons Freeway earlier, and even the freeway was jam-packed with spectators waiting their chance to see the president as he made his way towards the trademark. It appears as though something has happened in the motorcade route. Something, I repeat, has happened in the motorcade route. Several police officers are rushing up the hill at this time. Stand by just a moment, please. Something has happened in the motorcade route.
President Kennedy has been assassinated. It's official now. The president is dead. Women here in shock.
In the wake of the tragedy, the myth of Camelot took hold. The 1,000-day reign of a modern King Arthur. The idealized President Kennedy, cut down as he offered to guide America into a golden age, would become untouchable.
He's remembered for his youth, his vitality, his aspirations for doing the right thing, for a government that could be affirmative and not negative, that could make a difference in people's lives.
Publicly, Jack Kennedy had been an heroic and moral figure. Privately, he broke all the rules, and when he died, he was on the brink of being exposed. So what would have happened had he lived?
If in the second term, the American people had seen there was a bad Jack, could the good Jack have survived? Personally, I don't think so.
Bullets took his life, but into the foreseeable future at least saved his reputation.